Hello, good morning. Namaste. This is Ira Sahay, and I'm back again with another D Life podcast series. I'm a certified metabolic health coach, a D Life member, and also its media and operations head. I have with me today a very special guest with me. I think everybody knows him. Very handsome, very famous, very fit, Dr. Anthony Chaffee. But before we begin that, a bit of introduction on D Life and Dr. Chaffee. DLife.in is India's biggest, oldest, and the only award winning low carb platform, founded in 2014 by Anup Singh, an engineer, a silver medalist from India's Ivy League institution, IIT Roorkee, and a 14th year pill free diabetic. In 2011, it was Anup who pioneered the template of 100-gram carbs per day based on the liver's glycogen holding capacity, which was the upper limit of carbs on a pure vegetarian Indian diet in the Indian context, that subsequently helped thousands of Indian diabetics the world over find remission. This was the time when in India people were rehashing the Western model of keto, 30 grams carbs per day, and failing. Anup set the distinction that Indian low carb is not Western keto. The 100-gram carbs per day template is now being widely used everywhere, especially in Indian vegetarian context and in therapeutic carbohydrate restriction. DLife is the single biggest low carb platform in the world with 3,000 plus and more adding every year. Combined success stories, 2,000 plus original low carb keto recipes, highly recommended by Dr. David Unwin. 200 plus podcasts, a 24/7 interactive forum of metabolic health practitioners from the world over, and more. The DLife Diploma course in low carb nutrition and metabolic health is India's only legally tenable course. We are now the only one from India to also be CPDSO UK accredited, with the global biggest 60 hours credit to the course, and the only ones from India again to be the SMHP approved CMHE provider. Anup Singh, along with Shashikant Iyengar, was also the co-organizer of two global metabolic health conferences held from India in 2023 and 2024, which were historic events in the global low carb space. Dr. Anthony Chaffee also came as a speaker in the second metabolic health conference, and I had hosted him along with Anup. So in this podcast, I have now Dr. Anthony Chaffee, who is an American medical doctor specializing in neurosurgery who over a span of 20 years has researched the optimal nutritional habits for athletic performance and health. It is his assertion that most of the so called chronic diseases that doctors treat these days are actually caused by the food we eat or don't eat, and can, in many cases, be reversed easily with dietary changes. Attaining his MD from the Royal College of Surgeons, Dr. Chaffee is an all American rugby player too and a former professional athlete in England and America. Having first learned of the toxic nature of plants during his university education, he now practices a carnivore diet, is a leading figure in the global carnivore space. He currently resides in Perth, Australia, where he has a private practice in functional medicine and nutrition. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Anthony Chaffee. Very good to see you back.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to see you as well.
Yeah. So this is your first podcast with D Life, and I'm sure we'll need another one because I've tried to keep this as academic and as myth busting as possible. So we could get a deep dive into the carnivore diet itself. So
Mhm.
just to set the narrative, when you say plants are trying to kill you,
Mhm.
how scared should Indian vegetarians be, as it constitutes a large portion of their diet? For a population like India, what
Mhm.
is the way out? Because they're largely plant-based. So tell us in the context of the data that you looked at when
Mhm.
you made this lecture.
Mhm.
What is the summary of it all?
Well, I mean, in summary, plants are living organisms and they like to stay living organisms. And so they have defenses just like every other form of life on Earth. And while they're static, they're stationary, they can't run away or fight back like an animal can. They can make a lot of chemicals. So they're sort of the great chemists of the world. They make about 1 million different defense chemicals to kill, injure, and disable the different animals and insects trying to eat them, or fungus and bacteria as well. So this is why the vast majority of plants on Earth will just kill humans. And there are only a small fraction of plants that are considered edible, meaning that we can eat them without dying. But just because we can eat them without dying doesn't mean that they're 100% good for us or safe. We eat grapes and we eat avocados quite regularly, and yet grapes and avocados will both kill cats and dogs. So there are toxins in them. It's just we have more defenses against those toxins than we do other toxins, and more than cats and dogs. But we need to remember our origins as a species. We did not grow up vegetarian. We're not herbivores biologically, and so we have some defenses towards these plants, and the cultures that have eaten certain plants the longest have built up more defenses towards these defense chemicals. But that doesn't mean that they're completely immune. We see native populations such as the native Australians, the Native Americans, such as in the Great Plains, where they were largely eating meat. Once they go to a post-agricultural society and they're eating more plants than animals, they start getting the so-called diseases of civilization. That's what anthropologists call it. So before they go to in a pre-agrarian society, when they're hunter-gatherers, really mostly hunters, they gather if they have to. Plants have always been survival food rather than the optimal first choice. And when when they're in that pre-agricultural population, they have different health issues. They have accidents, emergencies, injuries, those sorts of things. Obviously, childbirth is going to always be traumatic and dangerous in these societies, and infections. Those are the large majority of the health issues that they face. They don't have any of the chronic disease issues that we face as a mainstay of modern society. And then when they go to a post-agricultural society, they become civilized, or they go to a city or something like that, and they start ingratiating themselves in the customs and norms of the society they've moved to. They all of a sudden start developing the diseases of civilization, which is diabetes and heart disease and cancer and all these other sorts of things, which do not afflict them to any great degree in their hunter-gatherer population. So these same diseases that they get are what we are commonly afflicted with throughout the world. They get it much more readily. So the Native Americans, the Native Australians have far higher rates of chronic disease, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, autoimmunity, these sorts of things, because they haven't had 10,000 years to build up some defenses. But even the cultures that have had 10,000 years of post-agricultural revolution, and before the agricultural revolution, obviously people were starting to figure out that you could eat some plants in some way, and then it exploded when they started doing that en masse. But even the peoples that have had tens of 10,000 years or more being introduced to plants to a large degree, we still get those same exact diseases. We just get them at a lower rate. So there are still poisons. We do still get poisoned by them. It's just certain people have more or less defenses towards them, but they will all catch up with you in the end. Slow poison is still poison. It's still going to get you. And so that's something that we need to recognize. In India, unfortunately, India has one of the highest metabolic disease rates and diabetes rates and heart disease rates and these sorts of things. So if it were a consequence of eating meat, then that really wouldn't apply. Last I saw, India had one of the lowest rates of meat consumption, or something like three
Yeah, that's less
kilograms.
than five. Yeah, less than
Yeah,
five. I mean, 1 year back it was five, and now I think it's somewhere between 3 to 4 kgs.
yeah,
Per
per
person
year.
per year per year. Yeah,
Yeah. So I mean that it's vanishingly small. And so if
yeah,
meat
yeah.
were the cause of diabetes and cancer and heart disease, etc., that wouldn't exist in India. And of course it does, and it actually at a very high rate. And so we know that it's not meat, and we can start to piece together these things from plants, because we know that they exist. I mean, the botany is not a new subject. This is something that we've known about for millennia. And we've known that you could eat certain plants, but you had to do that in a certain way. And certain plants were could be used medicinally in certain circumstances, and they could benefit you in those circumstances. Outside of those circumstances, they just cause harm. The other thing to remember is that we've never really just eaten raw plants like we do now. We're being told, no, we're all herbivores. Humans are just herbivores, contrary to all the available information that has ever been recorded. I mean, I was taught that in grade school. I mean, literally first grade. I remember being told that humans were apex
Mm,
predators. So this is just
mm,
longstanding understand. This is the long understood fact. And now people are trying to say that no, we're actually herbivores. It's not just morally justifiable or due to religious reasons. No, humans just biologically are herbivores. It's never been suggested by any serious scientist ever in history until just now, and people are trying to make.
And no salad paintings in the caves as
Yeah,
well
that's
found.
it. Yeah, I've never seen any cave paintings of a salad, but you do
Yeah,
see a lot of hunting pictures.
yeah, yeah.
And the traditional way of eating plants was actually we through technology, through intelligence, and um, through basic necessity. And when the megafauna were dying out, we weren't able to hunt big fatty animals. They say that, well, even though we were hunting, wild animals are very lean, so we weren't getting much fat. So, ooh, fat's still bad. No, that's not true, because we went after the biggest animals possible. We were hunting elephants, we were hunting mastodons,
Yes.
we we're hunting whales, and these sorts of things. A seal has a lot of fat on it,
Mm,
and the larger the animal, especially when you're getting into the cold extremes of the planet, going towards the polar extremes, they have to be fat. They have to have more and more fat on them so they can have that insulation to the cold. And so I don't see many seals getting heart disease, and they're obese, I guess you could say. You have a lot of fat on them, but and yet no heart disease. But neither do the Inuit who eat them. And so we were hunting large animals, and also in the polar extremes, in the colder areas that had a lot more fat on them. The larger the animal, the larger the proportion of fat. And the Native Americans would hunt bison, and people don't realize this because they look at the muscle meat and everybody trims off all the fat, all the subcutaneous fat, because that's the fashion. We've been told that
yeah.
fat is bad, so they
Mm,
trim all that off, not realizing there actually is quite a lot of fat in a healthy animal. Even a wild animal will have a lot of fat, subcutaneous fat, and intra-abdominal fat. The omentum is an organ inside the abdomen. It's almost entirely made out of fat. The mesentery is
mm,
the vasculature supplying the intestines. It's completely covered in fat.
yeah,
If anybody who's seen a video or done abdominal surgery in a human, you see it's just full of fat. There's just tons of
yeah.
fat there. That's true for animals as well. And that's
Mm,
typically why you'll see predators like lions, etc., going after the abdomen first. You have the belly
mm,
meat, and that's bacon basically. So that's a fattier
yeah.
part of the animal, and you get into the abdomen where all the fat is. So that's a very important part. And when people started not being able to get all the fat they needed, and some weren't, like people in the Great Plains, they were hunting bison, so they're going after the biggest
Mm,
animals possible because they had the most fat. They went after
yes.
the prized, biggest, healthiest ones. Most animals, most hunters aren't able to go after the biggest, strongest versions. They have to go to the children, the babies, the elderly, the sick. Humans were such good hunters. We went after the best example, and those were generally the healthiest and had the most fat because they weren't weak and sick and all that sort of stuff and used through all their fat stores. And they would scare like a whole herd of bison, or a large portion of it, out over a cliff. They would die at the bottom by falling, and then they would harvest them up and make pemmican, and they would take all the available fat, render that into tallow, and they would actually make pemmican, which was a mixture of dried, crushed up meat and fat. And that was actually 2 grams of fat to 1 gram of protein. It's actually very high fat. So when people say, well, we were still eating very low fat, no, no, we weren't. We always prized the fat. And when we weren't able to get megafauna and these big fatty animals, we started domesticating the largest animals available, which are, the bovine
Mm,
animal species. And we started trying to fatten them up, figuring out ways to fatten them up. Same with pigs. Lard was the staple product from pigs
mm,
up until 50 years ago, 60 years ago. And they also, started using dairy and, lactase persistence, where people can not be lactose intolerant. That came about sort of 15,000 years ago and really spread wildly because it was very helpful to get that fat from dairy. And that was the main part, was the cream and the butter. Skim milk was a bit of a throwaway item. They actually used
mm,
that to
mm,
fatten up pigs
mm,
for
mm,
centuries because it actually made
yeah.
them overeat when they mixed that with grains. And so they could get the pig fatter and fatter so they could get more lard out of it. And so, we really prized the fat. We really needed the fat. And then we started going into plant agriculture as well, or eating more plants. That's the thing too. People ask me, well, if humans are carnivores, why do we make amylase, which is an enzyme that breaks down
Mm,
starches? And the answer to that is that's a very recent adaptation. That only came around with agricultural revolution. So only about 10,000 years ago is when you started seeing that. growing the
Mm,
population. And so, because you're an agrarian society, you need to be able to break this down. The people that were able to get the most out of the grains and plants that they were eating were obviously the ones who were going to thrive and do better. And so that's when that actually kicked off. But we didn't have amylase before that.
yeah.
So
Oh,
obviously we weren't eating a whole bunch of starchy vegetables and grains before that,
mm,
not to any large degree anyway. And through technology and through necessity, we were able to start growing plants and using certain plants and trying to detoxify some of those plants or lower the toxic load. So we had all these traditional ways of preparing plants, such as fermentation, very important. Those bacteria will break down and eat the toxins and eliminate them and actually bring about, open up a lot of the nutrients, because another way that plants defend themselves is by just being less nutritious. They have all these vitamins and minerals and proteins, but they're locked up in ways that most animals can't break down. You have to be specially adapted to break these things down and access the nutrition. And
mm,
we're not. That's a perfect example of that we're not herbivores and we're not designed to eat these plants. First of all,
correct.
the plants we're eating
Mm,
now too, they didn't even
mm,
exist 50,000 years ago. These have all been cultivated typically from a single root ancestor, like brassicas. There's like 160 different vegetables that were all cultivated from a single plant source. And so, but we weren't eating any of these things for 50,000 years. We weren't evolving with them, which is why we don't have the enzymes to break down the toxins, and we don't have the enzymes to, break down and absorb these nutrients. So we have to ferment them. We have to cook them, heat them past a certain temperature for a certain period of time, like we do with beans and legumes, which can be quite toxic. And in fact, if you eat raw legumes like red kidney beans, which are a very common staple around the world, as little as 5 red kidney beans uncooked have put people in the hospital, as per the WHO. Their own
mm,
that they've said that, not me.
yeah.
And you have all these other sorts of things as well. So you have different processes, and the traditional way of processing corn in Mesoamerica was nixtamalization. It was a 7-step chemical process of adding different chemicals and substances that they found naturally, and we're able to mix that into the corn to lower the toxic load and increase the bioavailability of these nutrients. They'd soak it in lye for 24 hours and mix in different chemicals and earths and clay and ash and all these other sorts of things. You would do this to be able to eat these things and gain more nutrition out of them. So we sort of lost that idea. We've lost the understanding that that plants need to be respected. They have these toxins. That's just a fact, and it's a reality. And you deny reality at your own risk. Reality is always going to win. And so if you're going to eat plants, you really need to prepare them in these traditional ways that can lower the toxic load and bring out the bioavailability. But even then, it's still not the best option. It's still not going to get you all the nutrients you need. It's still not going to get you all the vitamins and minerals that you need. You do need animal source protein and fats for that. But you can at least do better. And so we've seen a sharp decline in the health of the people of India in recent decades, like we've seen the rest of the world. Okay, and there have been vegetarians in India for a long time, maybe not to the extent that there are now, maybe not, maybe they haven't eaten as little meat as they have now, but they've also been introducing more and more plant products that they wouldn't be eating traditionally, that they don't prepare in a traditional way, and they're getting more and more sick. And that's something that we're seeing around the world.
Mm, mm. Correct, makes sense. And the larger narrative of India being a vegetarian country is always hooked to the logic that our ancestors were eating vegetables and they were vegetarians. Whereas I just posted, and I've been talking about this since more than a year. The biggest text in the Indian context is the text of Ayurveda, written by a great sages, and that has meat listing for all ailments. So what is being talked about? I don't know. Just talking through their hats. Plants have always been mentioned as medicinal. They've never been mentioned as food. Food is meat and medicament is meat. So I think that really makes sense. And thank you for elaborating on this, Dr. Chaffee. We move on to the next question. As a carnivore and a certified healthcare provider in India, my number one battle and confusion is the misinformation around diet. As far as the carnivore diet is concerned, it's often believed and propagated that no research backs its purported benefits and that it's a fad diet. And often statements like blanket statements like it's a dangerous diet, are loosely given out by the Nutrition Academy, I would say. who are borderline illiterates. What do you think of that? What is the data suggesting in favor of the carnivore diet?
Well, the thing is that people need to remember is that, well, first of all, our biological design diet, what humans have been eating since humans have been humans and before, can't be a fad diet. The definition of a fad diet is something you're cutting off essential parts of the diet,
Yep.
and it's something that's sort of short-lived and goes away. Well, what we've been doing for 2 million years is not exactly short-lived. What's a fad diet is what we're doing now. We're eating a bunch of processed garbage food that has never existed in nature previously. Seed oils don't exist in nature. You can't go to a seed oil tree and just have it pour out. It's a involved chemical industrial process to refine and make these products, and they make up people a lot of money. I mean, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars every year, and more, as the years go on. So this is a big industry, the whole plant food industry, the whole processed food industry, the sugar industry. But these chemical compounds, some of these things just don't exist in nature. And so that is the fad, because we're eating these things, we're consuming these things, some of which haven't existed in nature, and some of which we certainly haven't consumed in great quantities in nature or even in civilization up until very recently. And so, that is the fad diet. As far as the evidence behind a carnivore diet, we look at what our biologically appropriate diet is. What have humans been eating for the longest period of time? We don't need to have any sort of randomized control trial to see if a lion it does better on meat or asparagus, but you just don't know because you don't have a randomized control trial. Pretty damn sure,
Right.
and you just look at what a lion eats, look at what an elephant eats, look at what a koala eats. Okay, feed it that in the zoo. You don't need to test it and kill a whole bunch of lions and koalas. You're feeding them nonsense and just to say that you did it. And we don't need to do that for humans either. What have humans been eating since humans have been humans? What do people
Mm.
in the wild, when they can get it, what do they eat? It's typically meat, and they fill in the gaps with plants. Um, Especially in those hunter-gatherer societies, it's people look at the Hadza and they say, oh, look at the Hadza, they eat this proportion of plants and this proportion of meat. That's access. They've been driven off their lands. They're not allowed to hunt their traditional game, which is the giraffe. That's the state symbol of Tanzania, and they're not allowed to hunt it anymore. That was what they normally hunted, were giraffes and other large game. They're not allowed to anymore. Now, the average animal that they get is the size of a bush baby, which is like 10, I don't know, 10 pounds or something like that. So it's not very big. And so they start the day off with a hunt every day. And when they're not successful, then they start the gathering part. So it's hunter gatherers as being a secondary. So they start hunting. If the hunt is not successful, then they go to gathering. They start looking for honey and things like that. And women will be getting tubers because you still have to eat. It's about
Yeah,
survival.
brilliant point there. Brilliant point. That hunter gatherer thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you can look at that and you just see what people have been eating. Objectively, there are no harmful chemicals in meat. The idea that saturated fat is somehow
Correct.
harmful has been completely shown to be outdated and shown to be a fraud. And there are objectively harmful things in plants. We know that. That's a fact. We've named them, categorized them, cataloged them, and quantified them and qualified them. Cassava root is a staple source of nutrition for 750 million people throughout the world, mostly the tropics. And that has so much cyanide, it can kill you. And so it has to be prepared in a certain way. So like what we're not, you don't kid yourself. Like these things have toxins. So we know that they have toxins. We can
Mm.
measure the toxins in these things. And so, that's going to be a danger if you add in those chemicals into your diet. But we have experimental data showing that meat-based diets are extremely healthy and beneficial. A carnivore diet is just a plant-free ketogenic diet, and there are thousands upon thousands of studies and randomized controlled trials in humans showing the benefits of meat-based ketogenic diets in humans for specific medical conditions with distinct um, outcomes and distinct endpoints for the studies. It's the most robustly studied diet in the world. It's really the only diet that's ever been studied in a robust manner. They talk about the Mediterranean diet and vegetarian diets and all these other sorts of diets, but they haven't been studied with the rigor, with the amount of randomized controlled trials with large populations that a meat-based ketogenic diet has done. So a carnivore diet, what is it? It's a plant-free ketogenic diet. So all the principles that apply to meat-based ketogenic diet apply to a carnivore diet, because that is a meat-based
mm,
ketogenic diet. It's just plant-free, so plant-free ketogenic diet. So we have reams of studies showing the viability of a meat-based ketogenic diet, and so we know that it's not only safe, but it can reverse massive amounts of diseases. So there are randomized control trials showing that putting people on an elemental diet, where you get rid of sort of everything else except the core nutrients and macros and micros that you need. They're typically done with ketogenic, because the elemental diet is basically it's very processed. It's sort of a scoop sort of nutrition, and it is broken down to the essential nutrients that you need, sort of broken down into their elemental form. So you don't have to like break down a whole bunch of proteins. It's just the aminos there, and it's typically ketogenic because this was originally designed for kids with epilepsy, and we've been using ketogenic diets for over 100 years for epilepsy, and over 200 years for diabetes. Actually, about 250 years, in the late
mm,
1700s, we started using ketogenic diets to treat diabetes. That was the only treatment for diabetes that we had on Earth for 140 years, until about 1921, when we discovered insulin and we started using that, and that just took over. That was the treatment then. But for 140 years or more, the treatment was a ketogenic diet. And so we have now experimental data in humans, large patient samples, statistically significant, et cetera, showing that when you put people on a high-fat, meat-based ketogenic diet, this reverses type 2 diabetes and can help significantly control type 1 diabetes. So you're not getting all these swings, you're not getting hypos, you're not using nearly as much insulin, et cetera. So we have studies showing this. And yet now we have epidemiological studies, which is much further down on the evidence hierarchy, where they manipulate this data around and say, oh, look, there's an association. People who eat more meat have higher rates of diabetes. Well, they also
mm,
have higher rates of sugar consumption and total caloric intake and alcohol consumption and smoking and lower rates of exercise. So what's your point? So that's
yeah.
why epidemiology is not great. But you have an experimental trial showing that a meat-based ketogenic diet reverses diabetes. And I put people on a meat-only diet, a plant-free ketogenic diet, so meat-exclusive diet, and we're reversing type 2 diabetes. But this epidemiology said, oh, but look, there's an association between meat and diabetes. Meat causes diabetes. I mean, you have to be, very gullible to fall for that, or just ignorant of the facts. You're just getting told by your trusted source, and you have no reason to doubt them. Then you hear people like me talking about this. That has to be a lie. Well, look it up for
Mm,
yourself.
mm.
So how can meat cause diabetes if you put people on a meat-only diet
Correct.
and it reverses diabetes? That
Mm,
those two things can't exist together.
mm,
Then you have, again, with the elemental diet, you put people with autoimmune issues like Crohn's disease on this, and it's found in randomized controlled trials to be a better treatment for an acute flare-up of Crohn's disease than prednisolone, the
mhm,
steroid. So just not eating certain things, just only getting the nutrients you need, nothing else. That's a better treatment for this particular autoimmune disease, than every single or than the best treatment, the gold standard treatment, steroids, for
mm,
this. Okay, so that means that something in the food is causing it, doesn't it? Because you're just removing the cause and the effect goes away. And we see this, time and time again in other sorts of studies as well. And so what is an elemental diet if not a steak? It has all the essential nutrients that you need and nothing else that you don't
mm,
need. And
mm,
this is exactly what I see in practice as well. It's interesting. It's just sort of a bit of a tangent, but from what I can see, autoimmune issues are our body responding to attacks from different sorts of chemicals that are getting into our body, invading our body, like plant toxins, like lectins, which will stick on and attack our body and our organs, and our body's making antibodies towards them. The idea was
mm,
that maybe we get an infection or something comes in and we make antibodies towards that infection, and then we get some cross reactivity with our body. Now our body's sensitized to our own body, and it attacks. That never made sense to me. I took postgraduate immunology before I went to medical school, and it was very clear that your body can't do that, because as your immune cells are maturing, they get put through rigorous sort of tests in your thymus and bone marrow where they're introduced to every single antigen in your body, every single molecule that your body makes, and pieces of them as well. And if any of these cells can react to them even slightly or make antibodies that can react to them even slightly, they get killed.
Mm.
So there's no immune cell that is allowed to get into your systemic circulation under normal conditions that will be able to react even weakly with your body. So your body will not be able to make antibodies towards a virus that is similar enough to your own body that there's cross react, because it can't. It can't make any antibodies that will be even slightly sticky. We say stick to things. So that's what will chemically bond even to a weak degree with our own antigens. Therefore, we cannot make any antibodies towards a foreign antigen that's similar enough that will get cross reaction. Can't do it. Your body can't do that. And that's actually not what we see anyway, because when you change people's diets, you can measure their antibodies in certain diseases like Hashimoto's, and you
Mm.
get rid of all these plants, you only feed them meat, and their antibodies just come down. Well, what's that about? Right? If your body
Mm.
is sensitized to your thyroid, in the case of Hashimoto's, it doesn't matter what you eat. Your body is
Mm.
sensitized towards that organ. It's just going to attack, attack, attack until that thing's dead, just like it would any other infection and foreign
Mm.
invader. And so, but it doesn't. Those antibodies just come down. Well, why is it coming down then? And then you eat, plants or something like that, goes right up. So what I think is happening is that when you get leaky gut, you get damage to your gut, you get, bacteria and all this other stuff, but you get the plant toxins that normally would not be allowed to pass through your gut. These things like lectins.
Mm.
Lectins are a protein with carbohydrate substructure that can bind to the surface proteins and molecules on cells. And so we know this about gluten. Gluten can bind onto surface markers on our enterocytes, our intestinal cells, and can damage them and cause leaky gut. We actually can see this on electron microscope. We actually see this invasion and damage to the junctions in between the cells, the tight junctions. And so that's damaging the gut, and you're allowing these things in, but then those lectins get into your body, and why would you think that they're not doing that inside your body? We've actually shown that they do go in there and they bind and attach and actually damage the organ. And then your body does what your body is supposed to do, which is attacks that foreign invader that's attacking your body. In autoimmunity, your body is doing its job. It's not deranged. Your body just doesn't know what to do and it's just attacking itself. No, it's not. It's attacking an invader that is stuck to your organs, and your body's making antibodies towards that attacker, and you're getting hit in the crossfire, right? And so, or maybe it's bound to a receptor and your body's making antibody towards that complex, but it's sort of a different structure now. And so you can get these specific antibodies, but you still need that lectin bound to that, and to make, give your body something to attack. And so when you just stop eating these things, you stop eating plants, you stop eating everything besides just, fatty meat that has been eating its own diet too, so it doesn't have other stuff in from its fake diet that could damage you. You see those antibodies just come right down because your body doesn't have anything to attack anymore, and so it doesn't.
Mm.
And we actually see this demonstrated very clearly in celiac disease. Celiac disease demonstrates this perfectly because we're very clear on this, that wheat germ agglutinin, which is a lectin, so gluten goes in, binds to the enterocytes, damages those enterocytes, and the body makes antibodies towards that complex. And then what happens? The microvilli and villi start getting flattened and damaged because your enterocytes are getting damaged in the crossfire. You have this lectin stuck to your cell. This antibodies coming to knock that out, and the cell's getting damaged too. And so you get this damage to your gut lining, and the microvilli and villi get damaged and destroyed. And so you have much less surface area, so you don't get absorption and all the problems that come with celiac disease. That, I think, is what's happening inside the body. If there's any, experimental sort of microbiologists or anybody out there that can show that and demonstrate that, I mean, that would be a huge step forward
Yeah.
for a human understanding. But I think that is 100% what's going on there, and it's
Mm.
displayed by the fact that, or demonstrated by the fact that if you just stop eating plants, you stop putting in these chemicals that don't belong there, antibodies just come right down and go away.
Mm. Yeah. Being an autoimmune patient myself at one point of time, I can absolutely confirm this. And even now, I've seen, whenever I try to, add grains back, even a spoon of lentils, a small spoon of lentils would just, kind of topple me off. So
Mhm.
definitely, I mean, but that's just for the sake of experiment. So that brings me to a connecting question, Dr. Chaffee. You say autoimmune melts away on the carnivore diet. Can we then assume that the carnivore diet is effective in reversing all autoimmune diseases, or are there exceptions too? What about autoimmune conditions like alopecia areata or Hashimoto's, which is a very stubborn condition, or ankylosing spondylitis, in which I've seen that it doesn't really reverse it, but probably just stops the progression. Does the carnivore diet help 100% in all of those cases? What are the cases in which it is not that helpful, if at all?
Yeah, that's a good distinction to make, because the autoimmune condition can damage parts of your body that may not be
Mm,
able to heal. Now, some will be able to heal, but like in the case with ankylosing spondylitis, you'll damage, your spinal structures and joints. And even if you stop that disease process, even if you stop the antibodies, you've already
mm,
caused damage, and it's going to lead to arthritis and disc degeneration and degenerative spines down the road, potentially, depending on how much damage was done. But type 1 diabetes, you have this autoimmune condition where you've damaged the beta islet cells of the pancreas that make insulin. If you don't get that to that in time, then you can kill all those cells and they may not grow back. So even if you stop the autoimmune process, the organ may be permanently damaged. And so that's something that's important to remember. What a carnivore diet and the exclusion of these plants and chemicals will do, all that will do, but it's actually quite a lot, is it can help reduce the damage from these lectins. They're not going to start binding onto your organs anymore. And then those antibodies don't have anything to latch onto and attack anymore. So those
mm,
antibodies come down. And so the best it can do is stop progression and allow your body to heal as much as it can. And certain tissue can heal better than others. Someone with Crohn's disease can be a devastating illness, but there's a lot of, the intestines are very vascular. And so they can heal actually quite readily. And as long as there's not too much damage, they can actually get back to fairly normal function. If you get rid of that disease process of attacking the cells. Hashimoto's, at a certain point, your thyroid is going to be dysfunctional. It's going to be non-functional, really.
mm,
And that's the normal progression. And people just say, yeah, don't worry about that part. That's going to happen. Your thyroid's toast. You just take it out eventually, and you'll just be on thyroid medication the rest of your life.
mm,
And yet I have probably over 100 patients with Hashimoto's, and every single one that's able to maintain a plant-free ketogenic diet, carnivore diet, their antibodies just come down.
mm.
Stress and poor sleep and these sorts of things seem to affect this as well. So if you're in a very high stress situation, or you're not sleeping very well consistently, then you can cause some metabolic distress. And it seems that sort of can mess around with your antibodies. But the vast majority of people with Hashimoto's, and you can measure Hashimoto's antibodies, they are very stubborn, like you said. But if you're very strict, mostly just red meat and water, but just at least doing the best you can, cutting out dairy. Things like ghee and butter usually typically do okay, especially ghee, because you're taking out all the sort of proteins and solids and things like that, and you just have the fat. So that seems to be fine for most people with autoimmunity that I've seen. I actually haven't seen anybody react negatively to ghee. But with Hashimoto's, it can take months and months and months, even over a year, before those antibodies, come down, especially if they're high. Sometimes people have antibodies in the hundreds or even the thousands. To give you sort of a frame of reference, I had a patient that came in to see me a couple months ago, and she had Hashimoto's, and there's two different antibodies, TPO and TG antibodies, and her TPO antibodies went from on just a red meat and water diet only, just lamb and water, and that's it. And she found that, we found that her TPO antibodies went from 650 all the way down to 50 in 8 months. So it took 8 months, but
Oh,
it down 600 points. So that's huge. And then her TG antibodies were 50 and they went to zero. They were non-detectable after 8 months. And so, then after a bit over a year, she had essentially no Hashimoto's, and she was, steadily coming off her medications as well. But we'll just have to see if her thyroid can recover well enough that she can get full function again. Some people won't. Every single autoimmune issue I've seen does extremely well. I haven't
so I
seen.
think it's safe to assume that at least it stops the progression. I mean, That's, I think, is 100% applicable on all autoimmune cases.
Well, I mean that's the idea. I mean that's the that seems to be what we're noticing. That's the phenomenon that we're seeing. And
Mm,
obviously we don't have, randomized controlled trials showing this for all autoimmune disease. But we do have some for, like Crohn's disease, like I said, with the elemental diet.
mm,
And we have other sources of information as well. But and there's plenty on ketogenic diets in general. I mean, you can look up any sort of disorder. You go to on Google Scholar, PubMed, whatever. But Google Scholar actually has a sort of a broader net. You go on Google Scholar and you just put in any sort of issue, MS, anything, diabetes, obviously, and you put in ketogenic diet. And typically there'll at least be some preliminary studies or case reports out there showing some sort of benefit, and some actually large studies that will show significant benefit. So I haven't seen any autoimmune issues that don't respond like this. I mean, I think that it doesn't mean that's going to hold true for everything, but at least so far that I've seen, I haven't seen anybody that any autoimmune condition that doesn't respond very well. But these things can take a lot
mm,
of time. You look at things like multiple sclerosis, where you have damage to the neurons and the myelination around the axons. Then you get obviously neurological dysfunction from that, but it can take a long time for your nerves to heal. So you can slow down or even halt that process potentially, if you sort of, if this is what we're saying, what we're suggesting is actually the mechanism, then your body still has to heal, and so you have to be in the right sort of place for that. You need B12, for instance. B12 is radically low on most populations, and I'm sure it is in India as well. And I'm sure that's reflected in the
very.
reference ranges, because
Mm,
the
mm,
reference ranges are the average for the population. So if the population gets more and more nutritionally deprived, that reference range will keep moving to the left. And so, because it's just it's an average for the population. And so if everybody's sick, then I guess no one's sick. Or if everyone's B12 deficient, then no one's B12 deficient. But of course they are. There's, I don't, do you know what units you guys use? Is it like picomoles per liter or something like that in B12?
sorry.
Do you know what units you guys use for B12 in India? A lot of countries use like picomoles per liter. Um, America uses like picograms per milliliter, things like that. But in any
Mm,
case, a
okay.
lot of people,
The
yeah, a lot of people,
units, you mean? Yeah, yeah,
yeah, the units, yeah.
yeah.
So a lot of places will use like things like
Mm,
picomole per liter, so
mm.
PMOL/L. And
Yes.
in England, those are the units they use. And Oxford University found in a study that they published in 2008, looking at B12, they found that people that had sort of significantly lower B12, like under 320, 330 and below, all the way down to the hundreds, into like the 100s, 170s and 80s and things like that. That population of people, they did annual MRIs every year, and they found that their brain shrank by 5% after 5 years. Right. So,
Mm,
this is causing significant damage and demyelination, because if your B12 is too low, then you can't remyelinate your cells. You actually can get demyelination. And so, since white matter, it takes up, is a large portion of the percentage of your brain's mass and volume, then you're going to lose some of that volume if you're getting demyelination. And so they found that under that level was enough to get demyelination, and their brain shrank by 5%. The the reference range in England, for much of England, goes from like 130 up to 500, 540. So most of that range, or half that range, is in that area that it's a significant and severe B12 deficiency, where you're actually getting brain damage and nerve damage and demyelination. So if you have MS, and it's not just enough to get rid of those antibodies, you need enough nutrients and vitamins and things like that. So you need enough
mm.
B12. For picomoles per liter, you want to be between 800 and 1200. For picograms per milliliter, is about 1100 to 1600.
We do measure in picograms, yes.
Picograms, yeah. So
Yeah.
picograms per milliliter, basically under 500, you can start
Mm,
seeing
mm,
people getting demyelination. That would be sort of that range that Oxford found. And so it's funny that Oxford University is in England, and yet England goes up to 540. Oh, that's enough.
mm,
Down to 130,
mm,
totally fine. No, we know for a fact that's not fine. And
mm,
so when I talk to people that are vegan, And, we're talking about, B12 and things like that. No, no, my B12 is fine. My doctor says it's perfect. Okay, well, the reference range goes down to 130 though. Okay, and it only goes up to 500, 600. So what are we really talking there? Because if you're in that range, then by my definition, you're too low on B12. You want to be above 800 for picomoles per liter. You want to be above 1100 for picograms per milliliter. So when people have it's like, oh, my B12 is perfect, it's 300. You don't know what you're talking about. Veganism rules.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's not actually right, because those reference ranges are way off there. And so I would imagine that the reference ranges in India are probably even lower than that,
Mm.
because B12 doesn't exist outside of
Yes.
meat. And so unless you're heavily supplementing, and they got a 1.4 billion people to supplement. Someone was saying here there's 250. Is that the top end, or is that the
Yeah.
low end, or is that the
Yeah.
average? It's still
Yeah.
low. My God.
Yeah.
So below 500 you're going to get so that's the
Mm.
bottom. Yeah.
Mm.
So at least they stop it there, but below 500 you're going to get demyelination.
Mm.
Right. So going down to 250 and saying that that's normal is not okay. That is a clear deficiency, and an extreme deficiency. So, when I have MS patients, I have a number of MS patients who have improved. Some were in wheelchairs, and
Mm.
then they go on to a strict lion diet, the red meat and water diet. Just works better for all autoimmune issues, it seems. Just the red meat and water, and you can do that with lamb, very easily, or goat, venison, these sorts of things. And they improve, and symptomatically they improve, but it can take months and months and months and months and months, 6 months, 8 months, a year for their neurological recovery to really get uh, to grow to a significant degree. But I have a number of patients who have then gone to their neurologist and gotten MRIs and found that they've actually had improvements in the lesions in their brain, which really doesn't happen with MS. That is basically unheard of. I'm getting ready to publish a case series of multiple carnivore patients who have actually had radiological regression in their MS on MRI, and symptomatic regression as well. That really doesn't happen. You sort of get this progressive state where you just sort of build up more and more lesions throughout the brain and spinal cord, and maybe they halt and they slow down and they're static for a while, but then they start progressing. So and there's this study on ketogenic diets and MS actually, and they looked at, and the endpoint really was the amount of new lesions that were popping up, because they weren't going to say like, oh, we're looking for a regression, because that's just never happens. We're saying, okay, does this slow down progression? Is this going to make, how many new lesions do you get? Right. And so it's like, okay, well, maybe there's less new lesions and this is beneficial, but I'm seeing in a carnivore diet, a plant-free ketogenic diet, that we're actually getting reduction in the lesions. In two ladies, we're still waiting for some of the MRIs to be repeated, and also to be looked at by an independent radiologist. But in two ladies, they have reported scans that they've had 50% resolution in their MS. And one who is my patient, she said to me that she was quite upset that her neurologist was very unsupportive of her. She said that the medications she was taking were really awful and she hated them, and she wanted to come off them, and she wanted to try this dietary intervention instead. The neurologist was very negative towards her, said she was being reckless with her health. She was going to be crippled. She was going to be in a wheelchair. She was going to kill herself. And she was really upset by this. She said she was crying in the consultation, and she decided just to do it anyway, and she got better. And she came
Mm.
out, and I didn't tell her what to do. She just
So that was
she did it on her own.
spontaneous remission, according to my doctors. That would have been a
Well,
spontaneous
that's it. Yeah. And that's what this guy said too. So she went for 8 months, and her symptoms were completely gone. She's completely functional neurologically, and certainly much better than she was. And then she got a repeat MRI, and she had 50% reduction in her lesions, which again does not happen typically in the normal population. And off medication, no medications, right? And so she went back to her neurologist, who was discussing the scan results with her, the MRI results with her. And he just said, like, I don't know how to explain this. I don't know why this happened. I've never seen this before. Uh,
Idiopathic.
Yeah, and so she said, "Well, do you think it might have been the diet then?" Absolutely not. No, couldn't possibly be. That is so close-minded, it beggars belief. And so she just
Mm,
said, "Right, I'm done with you." And so she just never went back and just fired him as a doctor, because he's not helping her. He's trying to put her on medications that were making her very, very sick and weren't helping. The problem was just getting worse. It was treating symptoms, not the disease. The underlying disease was getting worse. It's like if you have a house on fire and it says, well, there's smoke, there's fire. Okay, let's blow away the smoke, and then there won't be any fire. There's no smoke,
mm.
there's no fire. Well, no, that's not actually true. You're getting rid of the symptom. You're not taking care of the underlying cause of those symptoms. And so, yeah, so she just said, okay, I'm not doing that anymore. And so, yeah, we're going to write that up. We're going to write up a series of these. We actually have quite a number of them as well.
Mhm. So connected to this, I mean, you just explained what autoimmunity is, but then how are vegans and vegetarians, largely vegans, I mean, vegetarians are more in India, but there's this vegan gang, I would say, that is eternally claiming remission of especially autoimmune conditions. Is it possible on a vegan diet? And, what is, I mean, you already explained what meat exactly does to put autoimmunity into remission. But
Mhm.
is it possible for a plant-based diet to achieve the same results, specifically in an autoimmune condition?
Probably not, but you can get variations on a plant-based diet. If you're eating in a horrible junk food, processed food diet, you're probably going to bring more of these toxic elements into you and have a worse time of it and more progression, etc. And so going to a more clean, whole foods diet, especially if you're actually clever about it and you prepare these plants in ways that we have traditionally to lower the toxic load, fermenting things, cooking things in certain ways, and all the other sort of traditional means and mechanisms that we have. You're going to do better than you were before, but it's always compared to what any economist. It's always compared to what, compared to what, compared to what. Yeah, this economy is good right now compared to what. It's the economy is bad right now compared to what. It's always compared to what. And so, well, my symptoms improve compared to what? Compared to a highly processed, high sugar, high processed carbohydrate, high experimental seed oil sort of diet. Okay, that's great. I'm happy for you. Does that mean that you're going to do as best as you possibly can? Plants have toxins. 99.99% of pesticides and insecticides are naturally occurring in the plants that we eat. By weight, that means there's 10,000 times more toxic elements designed by the plant to kill animals and insects in the plant naturally occurring than the pesticides we spray on them. So it's not to say that pesticides are fine, which is what other people have concluded when they showed that there's so many far more toxic chemicals in the plants than the pesticides. The conclusion there was, well, since we know fruits and vegetables are super good for you, obviously the pesticides can't be that bad. And they're like, well,
Mm,
I came to a different conclusion, which is pesticides suck. They're toxic chemicals. We know they're there to kill things, right? So obviously that's not going to be all that good for you. And this is 10,000 times worse. So that
mhm.
tells me that those are actually something that should be avoided at all costs. So, I don't, I think I lost my train of thought there. Can you remind me
Yeah, how are
what
these
your original
people
question was?
claiming to get an,
That's right.
I
Yeah.
mean, possibly, is there a remission, in short, possible on a plant-based diet, the same results that we
Yeah.
are achieving on a meat-based diet, especially for
Yeah.
autoimmune conditions?
I'm sure that some people have certainly improved a lot. And but the thing is that I see no end of people on vegetarian diets. They've gone onto a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet in order to improve their health because they're told that this is really good for their health. And at first they get that honeymoon period where they are improving because they've cut out processed food. Now you can do a
Right.
processed garbage vegan diet, eat a bunch of Oreo cookies and things like that. Heroin, that's plant-based, right? So, you can do all these things that are plant-based and vegan that are horrible for you and actually get much worse outcomes. But then you can have a more clean and considered approach to it and improve in a lot of ways, but then eventually it catches up with you. And the majority of people that follow me on YouTube and social media, so we're talking about hundreds of thousands, over 1 million people, the vast majority are people that were formerly vegan and vegetarian and And a lot of them suffered with autoimmunity as vegetarians and vegans. In fact, their autoimmunity came about when they became vegan and
Correct.
vegetarian, a lot of these people.
Same with me. Same with me. And
There
yet,
you go.
when we put out results, week after week, there are some Indians, who would go and say that, oh, she's trying to convert.
Mhm,
Every other, condition we can probably deal, with on a vegetarian diet. But for autoimmune specifically, I do feel that the flare-ups do come back. It's a
mhm,
long-term deficiency that sets in. I mean, as you say, you said, there can be a honeymoon period and you can see effects, but what about the long-term, achievements that you're looking at? I mean, it's not a band-aid solution that you're wanting to give to people who are seeking you out, but
mhm.
it's in the larger interest of those people that you tell them about the benefits of the meat-based diet. And of course, you can show clickbait results, in a month or 2 months or 3 months. But that's not sustainable, I feel.
Yeah, and you see a lot of people that have tried plant-based and they have to go away from them. There was a study that looked at, like, surveyed a bunch of people that went plant-based, and they found that 84% of people that went plant-based ended up quitting. And the majority of them, the reason that they said that they quit was for health reasons. Their health was
Mm,
negatively affected by this. And the
yes.
vast majority of people, like I said, that follow me were formerly plant-based. They all had the exact same convictions and and ethos that we have. We want to be healthy. We want to do the right thing for ourselves and our children and our family and the planet. And they got caught into the lies that are being promulgated right now, typically by the processed food industry,
Mm,
because they
mm,
they profit greatly from plant-based nutrition. They know that people that go vegan and vegetarian, they don't just eat fresh quinoa every day from their own garden. They eat processed packaged food
processed food,
that is
yes.
made, by them, and they make trillions of dollars off this. So they're the ones pushing this, and they push this very hard. They spend tens of millions of dollars, actually hundreds of millions. Coca-Cola spent in 2020, 21, I think it was, maybe 2020. Anyway, Coca-Cola, or maybe it was 2015. Anyway, recently they
Mm,
spent $120 million a year on nutritional research. Why is Coca-Cola doing nutritional research? Because they're doing research on the processed food garbage that they sell, and they're trying to say that it's not all that bad. And this is the same
mm,
tactic that the tobacco companies use for decades, and the sugar companies use for decades, and the processed food companies use for decades. It's the same game plan, and it's out of the same playbook. And so the tobacco companies put out all these studies saying, oh, tobacco is not that bad, it's not addictive, it doesn't cause emphysema or cancer and all that sort of stuff. And they manipulated the data and the studies to come off with the answer that they wanted.
mm,
Coca-Cola is the same way. They're doing the exact same thing. They're spending $120 million a year on it. The other major processed food companies are spending similar amounts of money. And so it's been said that the entire processed food industry spends 11 times the amount of money on nutritional research than the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. So the vast majority of studies that are out there claiming that plant-based diets are great, meat is bad, sugar is good, aspartame is safe, and all these other sorts of nonsenses. And the people say, "Oh, look at all this data." It's corrupt data. You have to look at the source. Who's paying for it, who's funding that research, and it's typically not people that you want funding that research. So, and actually, the tobacco companies bought out many of the processed food companies back in the 1980s. Like Philip Morris bought several of the larger conglomerates of food companies, and they became the largest processed food manufacturers on earth in the 1980s, because this is when the story came out that they'd actually been lying for decades, and they actually knew how bad cigarettes were, and they were lying to Congress, and their own memos came out. And so they got fined like $400 billion, which is, I mean, how many trillions of dollars did they make over the decades, and how many, millions of lives, billions of lives were negatively affected by this? Who knows? So that's, I mean, that's just a nothing. I mean, these people should have been held for criminal charges because they were lying about something that's toxic. They were killing people. They were causing disease and causing harm. They should have absolutely been thrown in jail. You know, that's malice aforethought. They knew that this could cause cancer. They knew that it could cause emphysema and heart disease and other sorts, and it was addictive. They knew that it was harmful in all of these ways, and yet they lied about it and said, "Oh no, everything's great." Um, you should go to jail for that. In fact, you should be tried for crimes against humanity. I mean, the amount of people that they harmed is just incalculable. And then these same people bought out some of the major food processing companies and started just doing the same racket there, by getting their scientists in there to make food as addictive as possible. So you just eat, right? And you buy more and more and more of their product, and you know, their health be damned, it doesn't matter. And and then, you know, and then that couples in with the health industry, which makes, you know, tens of trillions of dollars a year, estimated about $14 trillion, just to treat 5 diseases worldwide, which is diabetes, cardiovascular disease, COPD, mental health disorders, and cancer. So not even all the autoimmune issues and Alzheimer's and osteoporosis and Parkinson's, all those others, just those 5 estimated to be about $14.5 trillion a year worldwide by 2030. So, you know, there's this whole unholy alliance going on here where the food companies are heavily invested in the pharmaceutical companies, and pharmaceutical companies are heavily invested in the food companies, and because they scratch each other's back, you know, they make a lot of money off of it.
And you're right. The data suggests that I
Mm.
think the pharma is now in the US. It has about 9 to 10% stake in the GDP. So
Oh
that's the
wow.
goal that yeah.
Yeah, wow.
So I'm not sure about the right number, but I think it's close to that. So that's the
Yeah,
stake they have, you know, in the messaging that they send out
yeah.
with regards to nutrition. So to coming to very important questions, Dr. Chaffee, on the carnivore diet, I think we'll quickly go through these. Um, if one wants to transition from a high carb diet and especially from a vegetarian background, what are the tips that you would want to give out, you know, in terms of transitioning? And then we'll come to you know, organ meat and you know, how we should be taking that. But first, the tips to transition.
Well, the main thing is that once you sort of got it in your head to do it, then you should try to strike while the iron's hot and try to do it right then. If you can just start with getting rid of processed food, that's a big step. Try getting rid of carbohydrates and processed carbohydrates, refined sugars, things like that. That's a huge first step. If you are gung ho about it and you just want to go into it and you're happy to make that transition, a lot of people do, even from a vegan diet, and they do very well with that. Some people find that they need to transition a bit more slowly, or they, you know, mentally they need to transition a bit more slowly because it's a big departure from the way they've been eating. But, you know, first and foremost, you need to get rid of processed food. You need to get rid of processed carbohydrates, refined sugars, etc., seed oils, all these sorts of things. Make your meals at home, cook whole foods, vary up the types of plants that you're eating because they all have different types of toxins, and so you don't want to eat the same plant every day because you'll get a buildup of those toxins. And make sure that you're eating a lot of fat because the fat's really important. If you're at some point you need to stop, right? And so you need to have a clear date. On this day, it's just meat after this. It's like smoking. Like, well, I'll just sort of reduce it as I go. No, you need to have a clear thing. It's okay. I smoke a pack of cigarettes a day now. Next, on this date, it's going to be 3/4 of a pack, and it's going to,
Mhm.
next week's going to be half a pack, and then a quarter of a pack, and so on. And on this date, it's over. Otherwise, you spend 20 years supposedly quitting smoking. You see people do that all the time. So if you're going to transition slowly, just fine. You need to have a clear date. You put an X on the calendar. On this date, all processed, you know, food is gone, refined carbs and sugar out, seed oils too. And then the next week it's like, okay, now I'm cutting out, you know, seeds and legumes and grains. Okay, that's all out. You know, the next week I'm cutting out all nightshades, potatoes, tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, all that stuff. And then the next week, you just, everything else is gone, right? So you just have to have a clear thing in about a month. Just say, okay, on this date I'm dropping this, on this date I'm dropping this, on this date I'm dropping this, and the whole time you're focusing on meat, eating more fatty meat and eggs. You can live your whole life on eggs, and so that's not a problem if people, you know, want to maintain their sort of vegetarian status, and if they're okay doing eggs, eat eggs for the rest of your life. There's no problem with that. You want pasture raised eggs, obviously. They're a bit better, a lot better. That's pretty much it. Otherwise, you want to try to get rid of the things out of your house that aren't there. If you're trying to quit smoking, you don't want a bunch of cigarettes laying around the house. And so you want to get those out, you get those temptations away. It's not always possible when you're living in a house with other people who don't share your desire to change the way that they eat. But if you
Mm,
are, then take advantage of that and throw away all the plant-based foods that you have and just stock meat and eggs. And that's goes for either slow transition or just to jump into it. If you're going to jump into it, clear the house, get it out. You said, well, I don't want to throw it out because what? Because you're planning on failure. Well, if I don't, it costs a lot of money. Okay, well, cigarettes cost a lot of money too. Do you want to smoke again? No, then throw away the cigarettes, right?
mm,
Or like if your kid, well, my kid, bought some cereal and this and okay, if your kid, brought back a bag of cocaine, what are you doing with it? You're flushing it
yeah.
down the toilet and you're smacking him in the head. That's it doesn't matter what it costs. Like that stuff's poison. It's not coming in the house. And so you'd have no problem doing that with things that like that's bad. That can't be in here. Um, but all of a sudden, it's food's like, well, it's not that bad. We need to understand it is that bad, and this is what's
Mhm.
causing disease and harm. So just try to get rid of it if you can. Give it to other people if they still eat that sort of thing, or you don't like them and you don't mind them being poisoned. And try not to have that in your house around you. And that can really help, because when you have a craving, have a desire for something, if it's right there in front of you, you're much more likely to succumb to that. And that's pretty much it. You just and overall you just eat. When you get to that point where you just like, okay, I'm just eating meat now, you just eat fatty meat until it stops
Does,
tasting good.
sorry to interrupt you here, but very pertinent question. Does grass-fed and grain-fed make a difference, in the larger scenario? Because what if people do not find grass-fed meat, everywhere and all the
Mhm.
time?
No, that's fine. Grass-fed and grain finished are definitely different creatures. They have a different constellation of nutrients. They have, grass finished is that does objectively have more nutrients, micronutrients, vitamins, has better DHA and EPA versus omega-3 or omega-6s and things like that. So it is objectively has the better nutritional profile. But in general, grain finished beef and that's it's grass finished is not going to be accessible to everybody or not going to be affordable for everybody. Grain finished is great. I mean, it's amazing. I sort of think of it as the gold and silver medalists at the Olympics. Silver medalists lost to gold, and that's sad. But the silver medalists also beat everybody else on earth. So it's actually a pretty strong position to be in. I mean, I ate just Costco beef. It's just grain finished beef for years. I checked all my vitamins and minerals and hormones, all these sorts of things, and they were all optimal. Not in the reference range for the lab, but optimal in my reference range is that, for an optimal human being, 25 years old. And that's a 25-year-old healthy person in optimal sort of nutrition status. So that was without taking any supplements. That was with just eating that meat. So you'll do amazingly well on any meat. So you eat fatty meat until it stops tasting good. You eat any kind of meat that you enjoy, that makes you feel the best, and that you can afford and have access to. And that's going to be
Yeah.
different for different people. And but no, you can definitely have grain finished. If you can get regeneratively raised, grass fed and finished meat, then that's amazing.
Yeah.
But
So
if you
essentially, don't
can't,
bother too much about, all of these and just eat fatty meats.
just do your best.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next question is, how good are organ meats and how often should, they be included in the carnivore diet? What about those, who are not able to include it in their diet? Are they missing out on something? And the
Mhm.
question related to it is about hypervitalemia, if at all it exists. What is the quantity of the organ meat to be taken in a regular carnivore diet?
Yeah. So it's a good sort of segue, because if someone does need a bit more nutrition, if you're having your sort of grain finished factory farm sort of meat, it's not going to have as many nutrients as the grass finished sort of kind. But if you add in a bit of organs, it'll flush you out. So the organs are extremely nutrient dense. They're the most nutrient dense part of the animal, which is great. But like you alluded to, that can that could be a problem because they're so nutrient dense that you can get a buildup of these vitamins like hypervitaminosis, especially with the fat soluble vitamins. They can build up and linger on for a lot longer than the water soluble vitamins, like vitamin B12. Like if you get too much B12, okay, you just pull back on the organs for a couple of days, and drinking water will just wash that out. It's not that big of a deal. But with vitamin A or something like that, you get a hypervitaminosis A, and that can cause thyroid dysfunction. That can cause other sorts of issues in your body. That too high can kill you. Obviously, anything too high can kill you. But this is why the Inuit know that you don't eat the liver of a polar bear, because it's so rich in vitamin A that it will kill you. The vitamin A is toxic. It will kill you. So you're not really going to get that far on cow liver unless you really just overdo it. But you can still get moderate
Can
hypervitaminosis.
it be eaten daily? Can it be eaten every day? Can organ meats be eaten every day? Or
Yeah,
what is the ideal way to eat them?
yeah. I think that you keep it in respect to the proportion of the animal. So we're trying to do what's natural here for our species, and so we have to think of that in context of hunting. So if we took down a buffalo or a sheep or a deer or something like that, a big animal like a large stag or a buffalo or something like that is going to have meat on that, skeletal muscle, meat and fat, that will feed an individual for 2 years, potentially, depending on how big the animal is. It's got one liver, it's got one heart, it's got two kidneys. So we need to keep that in proportion and just remember that it's a big liver, but that's spaced out over 2 years potentially, right? So for that size of an animal. And so you don't need that much, and especially if it's something that's grass-fed finished, eating its natural diet. I haven't really seen people, when I test, do robust blood testing on my patients. And so I'm looking for vitamins and minerals and all these things. The ones that are doing grass-fed and finished beef and not even worrying about organs, they're all in the optimal sort of levels. I was in optimal levels for nearly everything, even on just Costco beef, and I was just shy of those perfect levels on like a couple things like vitamin D or something like that. Now, because I have every now and then I'll have a bit of liver. At that point, I probably had liver about maybe 3 times in a decade, and everything was nearly perfect on just grain finished beef. But everything was, now I'm eating more grass fed beef. I'm having a bit of liver every now and then. Now my vitamin D is absolutely perfect. My B12 is perfect. My folate's perfect. My zinc and magnesium, all these things are perfect. Um, and so, you just have a little bit, you don't need all that much, but there are certain conditions that, that can change that. If you are very nutrient deprived when you're starting this, and especially coming from a vegan or vegetarian diet, you are going to be, or if you're vegan, vegetarian, or eating processed food, or just eating a standard diet, your diet is very nutritionally deprived. So liver is your best friend. Organs are your best friend. This is where you're going to get the majority of your nutrients from. And it's very important that you get them. And so if you are eating a mixed diet, you should absolutely include organs. If you're only eating meat, you should seriously consider having organs early on, especially, but you only need, a few ounces a day. And then even pull that back to a few ounces a week after a few months of this. And you should be fine, but you try to keep that into proportion. There are some people that have different gene mutations like MTHFR, where they don't methylate B vitamins properly, and they need just a bit more folate and B12. And so you'll see sometimes where people are on a traditional carnivore diet, and they're not using organs, and they're just eating grain finished meat. Their B12 just isn't quite where it should be. Their folate isn't quite where it should be. You add in, a couple ounces of liver 3 days a week, it's perfect. So in those cases, that's great. There are autoimmune issues, touching back on the autoimmune issue, where you can get permanent damage to an organ, and it's completely defunct after that. You can get something called pernicious anemia, which attacks the parietal cells in the stomach, which make intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor binds to B12, and your body absorbs that complex. You can't absorb B12 without intrinsic factor. And so if you have damaged your body's ability to absorb B12, even to a moderate degree, because I've checked people that just weren't absorbing B12 properly, and they were on, a line diet, red meat only. They were eating organs and liver, fairly regularly, at least 3 times a week, and nothing else. So none of these anti-nutrients that come in plants that block and bind to different vitamins and minerals to wipe them out and not let you absorb them. And their B12 was still low, and it's like, okay, and you give them an injection, it goes up and then just comes right down, it comes right down, it comes right down, but their diet is replete with B12, so they're obviously not absorbing it. And so I checked them for pernicious anemia, and there you go, they have pernicious anemia. They have these antibodies there. They're very low now because they're on an autoimmune
Mm.
diet and protocol by eating only red meat, but they were still there. So previously, these likely would have been much higher. Now, he was still absorbing some, or it's actually, I've actually found that in a few people, pernicious anemia. It's more common than people realize because people don't recognize it until it's a complete inability to absorb B12, and then it's actually life-threatening. You get very, very sick. You get anemia, and you can die from this. So, I was able to catch these things earlier before they became a desperate problem. Um, and then you just need to know that, I mean, you're gonna need, if you have a malabsorption issue, then you need to have more nutrient dense food like organs. If you have a complete malabsorption issue like pernicious anemia, then you're going to need to look at supplementation such as sublingual under the tongue B12 or
Mm.
even regular injections, things like that. But I think that it's a great idea if anybody's on a mixed diet, if anybody's eating a vegetarian diet or they're eating a standard diet, that adding organs is probably the best thing you could do from a nutrition standpoint, besides cutting out all the
Yeah.
garbage that's hurting you. But it's going to add so much nutritional value to your meals, just adding in a bit of organs. If you're on a carnivore diet, it can really be helpful, especially early on, and to help catch you up because you're going to improve. You're just eating meat, you're eating very nutrient dense food, you're cutting out the anti-nutrients that are going to block out the absorption, and you're going to be doing better and better and better. Most people just feel, man, I'm feeling so good, so good, so good, and they're just getting better and better and better. But sometimes you can be optimizing, you can get there more quickly by adding in a bit of organs, or maybe you have a malabsorption issue. I had one patient, she was carnivore for a year. She was actually a professor of nursing, retired professor of nursing, very bright lady. And she was feeling great. But she said, I feel like maybe another year of this, and I'll really feel great. I feel like there's just a little bit extra, just something else. And we checked her nutrients, her vitamin D and her B12, and they just weren't quite right. And we're testing her, and she has these malabsorption issues. And so it was just good to know that. So now we're adding in a bit of organs and things like that, and that's starting to bring that up. But just without the organs, she wasn't quite where she needed to be because of these malabsorption issues. So it's good to know your own body and know what you need. The vast majority of people just do fine on fatty meat and water, but adding in a bit of
Mm.
organs is not going to hurt you as long as you keep it in proportion.
Yeah. I have a few very important questions, but I think I'll
Mhm.
ask the most important first too.
Mhm.
So does our body store the, high fat that we advise and we eat on a pure carnivore diet? Because we always say fatty meat and, huge amounts of fat. Does our body store that?
Well, the thing is that you are going to store some fat. I mean, that's the purpose of fat. That's our energy reserves, and so it's there for a reason, and it's very very energy dense. A 65 kilo individual who's at 6% body fat has 2,300 kilocalories stored glycogen in their liver and their muscles, but they have over 35,000 kilocalories of energy stored in that 6% body fat. So that is our major, major store of energy, which is why you want to be in ketosis, because you can tap into that fat reserves and those energy reserves, and you can use the glycogen alongside that and replenish your glycogen instead of running out of it. Um, but you actually have a limited capacity to absorb fat. So we're eating a high fat diet, but basically all animals are on a high fat diet. Saturated fat is what makes the animal kingdom go round. Carnivores, 70% of animals are carnivores, and they eat animals with fat on them, and they go for the fat first, and they get a high proportion of their calories from fat. But also herbivores that eat fibrous plants, they don't actually break down that fiber into glucose. No vertebrate animal makes cellulase, which breaks down cellulose. It's actually the microbacteria or the microorganisms like bacteria in their gut that eat the fiber and, as a byproduct, produce saturated fat, and then they die off and they get absorbed as protein. So even cows and gorillas, they're getting 70 to 80% of their calories from saturated fat. And so the animal diet in general is a very high fat diet, but your body, and our body in particular, has a specific amount of fat we can absorb. We have a limited capacity to absorb fat. We make bile in order to absorb fat. We can't really absorb fat without bile. We can absorb some. It's typically like MCTs, medium chain triglycerides. We can absorb those through the portal hepatic system. Um, but the rest of the fat gets picked up by bile and absorbed through the lymphatic system and actually bypasses the liver. That's how important and special fat is to our body. It actually bypasses the liver, it has a free pass into our body. We just need this, and it's just the MCTs and some things can still go through the liver. But once you run out of bile, you really can't absorb fat past the single digit percentages of the fat, and most of those being MCTs. And so they just go out. And so you could eat an entire bucket of fat, just drink, jars of ghee, and you would absorb what your body had the capacity to absorb, and the rest would be eliminated in your stools. And then this is why some people get loose stools, because they eat a lot more fat than their body can absorb, and it just comes out dramatically. And so, but either way, you can't overeat fat because your body simply can't absorb it unless you're doing something, silly like taking ox bile and then you're forcing your body to absorb more fat than it actually wants to. Then sure, where's that gonna go? It has to get stored, right? And so you're going to store some of these things, and that's the entire purpose of eating, is to have energy and have that energy in reserve down the road. But there's no such thing as eating too much fat. That's just not a thing. And it's not just a calorie source anyway. There are essential fatty acids that you have to have or you can get sick and die. There are essential fat soluble nutrients that you have to have or you can get sick and die. So you need this stuff. And you have 5 organs working in concert just to absorb fat. Your stomach starts breaking down food. Your liver makes bile. Your gallbladder stores bile and concentrates it so that you can have it ready if you don't get a meal for several days. This is where gallstones come from too, because any hyperconcentrated solution at rest forms crystals and precipitate, and that's what gallstones are. So eat more fat, you won't get gallstones. And then the pancreas makes enzymes that break down the fat, like lipase, and then the small intestine absorbs it. So you have 5 organs all working together just to absorb fat, and those don't work properly together, you're not going to absorb the fat. You may not absorb any fat at all. So that's how important fat is to the body. It's working very hard to absorb fat. Fat is the only macronutrient that does not trigger insulin. Insulin is the fat storage hormone. You cannot store fat without insulin. And so type 1 diabetics, they don't make insulin, and so they could eat 50,000 calories a day. It doesn't matter. They're not going to store fat. They waste away until they die, unless they get some insulin, or they go on a ketogenic diet, which was the only treatment for diabetics for 150 years. And I think that's probably because of the fat. You're being in a state of ketosis. You can run off that fat that you're eating now. But then you have an insulinoma, which is a tumor that secretes a high volume of insulin. And people get enormously obese. It doesn't matter what they eat. Everything that they eat that goes into their body, all that energy gets stuffed immediately into your fat cells. And so you're just tired and lethargic all the time. You feel miserable, and you just have to eat. Your body's just telling you, hey, look, you have to eat, you have to eat, you have to eat, you have to eat, you have to eat. And you just get enormously obese. So it's hormonal, and fat is the only macronutrient that does not affect insulin, and insulin is a fat storage hormone. So the idea that if you eat fat you'll get fat was completely wrong. It was a baseless accusation that doesn't fit with biochemistry or reality. And so people that eat a lot of fat and don't eat carbohydrates, they're actually quite thin. I've eaten 70-80% of my calories from fat for the better part of a decade, and I don't go above 10% body fat, whether or not I'm working out. And so, some people say, well, if you're eating all that fat, you have to work out a lot, right? I'm like, no,
Yeah.
it's
We just
actually
had an
amazing.
interaction yesterday, I think, on Twitter, and I think this is a
Mhm.
very pertinent question because every time you hear the same thing, the fat is you shouldn't be going for fatty meat, and or you are eating excess fat. So this kind of clears up the confusion around it. One last question, Dr. Chaffee, can one be in keto while being on a carnivore diet, and how?
Going to be in ketosis on a carnivore diet. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, it should be a ketogenic diet. If you're drinking a lot of milk, then, that can kick you out of it. If you're adding in, some things that aren't fully carnivore, like fruit and honey or something like that, you can kick yourself out of ketosis. But yes, you can certainly be in ketosis, especially if you're eating enough fat. If you're eating a lot of protein, you are going to get a bit of an insulin spike, and that can bump you out of ketosis. But it's
Yes.
typically going to be transient. And so especially when you're eating fatty meat, you're eating high density nutrition, you're not going to need to eat as much or as often. And so you're eating a big fatty meal of meat and you eat until you're full. Oftentimes, I'll only eat once a day, twice a day at most, especially if I'm
Mm.
working out and my body wants to put on muscle. Then I'll, eat once or twice a day at most. But so I'll have a bit of a bump in my insulin during that time. And the rest of the day is completely, going to be completely in
Yeah,
ketosis.
my question was from that point of view. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah. So if you typically will be in ketosis. And the thing is too is that, do we is the purpose of ketosis to have extraordinarily high ketones, or is it to just be in a fat burning metabolism, having access to our fat and having low enough insulin that we're not disrupting all these different processes? Because insulin affects over 100 different physiological metabolic processes in our body, and they're all very important. And so if you get it out of balance, and you get it too high, then everything is out of balance with all these other sorts of physiological processes. So I think that's the main majority of the benefit that you get, or the whole point of being in ketosis is just being in that metabolism. When you have people in long-term ketosis, people like the Inuit, or like myself, I've been in, for, like 7 years now. My ketones are 0.4. We said, well, you're not even really in ketosis then. I'm like, well, I am, because I can run on my fat, and I'm running on my fat all the time. And that's fasted. That was 14 hours after eating, 15, 16 hours after eating. So, but my insulin's dead low. My ketones are there, but I'm using my ketones because you're more keto adapted. It's not that you're making less ketones, it's that you're using them more effectively. And so you just don't have very high levels. But you can definitely be in ketosis. I think the main benefit is, or the main point is, just being in a fat metabolism. And so, you can certainly notice that your insulin will be down further on average if you just eat one big meal a day, or within a smaller eating window. And but you'll still be able to burn your fat regardless, even if your ketones aren't as high as you want them to be. So yeah, you definitely can. Sometimes you just want to play around with how you're eating. And sometimes if people have a specific reason they want to get their ketones up, like epilepsy or cancer, then eating in those smaller eating windows is a good option.
Makes sense. So with this, we come to the end of this podcast. Thank you, Dr. Chaffee, for coming over and speaking to us. It has been a wonderful session, and I think we'll need more of this because we had just started to, warm up on the carnivore diet. So probably we'll have one or two more in the coming days. Thank you so much for coming. And I think after this, we'll just click a picture. But I end this session with Dr. Chaffee. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining in. We'll be back again with another D Life podcast series next Sunday, or whenever we have one scheduled. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.